Elon Musk walked into a talk show, but by the end it was the host who was on the hot seat. The email came in like any other. A simple subject line: invitation to the Bryant Palmer show. Elon Musk barely glanced at it at first. He got these all the time: requests from talk shows, news programs, tech panels. Most he declined. But Bryant Palmer was different. Palmer's show was one of the biggest on television. Known for its blend of humor, controversy, and sharp interviews, it had a massive following. People tuned in not just for the guests, but for Palmer himself, the way he pushed boundaries, challenged ideas, and sometimes outright humiliated his interviewees. Musk hesitated. His PR team had already vetted the request. "It's a good opportunity," his assistant had said. "Palmer reaches millions." Musk wasn't worried about exposure, but he was curious. He knew Palmer's reputation, how he could turn an interview into a spectacle, how he thrived on making his guests uncomfortable. But Musk had never been one to back down from a challenge. "Set it up," he finally said. The day arrived, and Musk found himself in a sleek, glass-walled studio in Los Angeles. The green room was quiet, filled with the low hum of distant conversations. A production assistant handed him a bottled water, then disappeared. He checked his watch. The interview was set to begin in 10 minutes. Across the room, a large screen played highlights from Palmer's past interviews. Musk watched as clips of political leaders, Hollywood actors, and CEOs flashed across the screen. Some laughed nervously, some argued. Others sat stone-faced as Palmer toyed with them like a cat with a mouse. Musk smiled slightly. He knew what was coming. He had been through enough interviews to recognize the pattern: bait, provoke, wait for a reaction. The real question was, how far would Palmer push? A stagehand appeared at the door. "5 minutes, Mr. Musk." He stood, adjusting the sleeves of his black jacket. Then, with the ease of a man who had faced rockets exploding mid-air, factories failing, and financial meltdowns, he walked toward the stage. The studio was packed. Hundreds of people filled the seats, waiting. Some were die-hard fans, others skeptics, and a few had probably just come for the drama. The set was modern, a circular stage surrounded by bright LED panels. A large desk sat at the center with 2 chairs, one for Palmer, one for Musk. The host himself was already there, flipping through a stack of cue cards. Bryant Palmer looked up as Musk approached, his grin wide, practiced. "Elon," he said, standing up to shake his hand. "Glad you could make it." Musk shook his hand firmly. "Likewise." They took their seats as the audience hushed. The show's theme music played, cameras rolled, and the stage lights dimmed, leaving only the 2 men in sharp focus. Palmer turned toward the camera, flashing his signature smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest tonight. The man behind Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and a dozen other companies I probably can't pronounce. The one, the only, Elon Musk." The audience clapped, some cheering, others murmuring. Palmer leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "So, Elon," he began, his voice smooth, "let's get right into it. People call you a genius, a visionary. Some say you're changing the world. Others think you're a complete lunatic." He chuckled, waiting for a reaction. "Which one is it?" Musk smiled faintly. "I think history will decide." Palmer tilted his head. "Fair enough. But let's talk about something a little more interesting than just history, shall we?" There was something in his tone, playful but sharp. The audience sensed it. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat, but Musk had expected that. Palmer leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers. "Elon, you've built rockets, electric cars, and even implanted chips in monkey brains," he said with a smirk. "Some would say you're playing God. What do you say to that?" Musk chuckled. "I'd say if I were playing God, I'd at least make sure my rockets didn't explode." The audience laughed, but Palmer wasn't done. "Right, but let's be real," he pressed. "You've got more money than entire countries, and people worship you like some kind of prophet. Do you ever wake up and think, maybe I should slow down before I turn into the next Bond villain?" The crowd chuckled again, but there was something in Palmer's delivery, something just a little too pointed. He wasn't joking. Not really. Musk nodded slowly, considering his response. "I think if I were a Bond villain, I'd at least have a secret lair by now. But unfortunately, I still live in a $50,000 house in Texas. That got a few laughs, but Palmer wasn't letting go. He flipped through his cue cards, pretending to search for something. "Ah, yes," he said, tapping one. "Speaking of that house, didn't you just fire most of the janitorial staff at X?" Musk's expression didn't change. "We had to make some adjustments, yes." "Adjustments," Palmer repeated, his grin sharpening. "That's an interesting way to say, left people jobless right before the holidays." The audience murmured. The energy in the room had shifted. Musk was used to tough questions, but this was different. Palmer wasn't probing, he was provoking. "I assume you're talking about the San Francisco office?" Musk asked, his tone even. "That's the one," Palmer said, leaning forward. "Reports say people were crying, Elon. Crying. You've got billions in the bank. Was that really necessary?" Musk exhaled quietly. "I think you know that running a company isn't about keeping everyone happy. It's about keeping it alive. X was losing $4 million a day." Palmer shrugged. "Must be tough being a billionaire and making all those sacrifices." The audience gave a nervous laugh. Some clapped, others stayed quiet. Musk didn't flinch. "It's tough making a company work. There's a difference." Palmer tilted his head, sensing an opening. He gestured toward the crowd. "You hear that, folks? Tough being the guy who owns private jets and sends cars to space." A few more chuckles, a few more murmurs. Musk let the moment sit. Then he leaned forward just slightly. "Do you want to have a real conversation, Bryant, or are you just here to perform?" The air in the room tightened. The audience went dead silent. Even Palmer blinked, just for a second. But he recovered quickly, flashing his signature smirk. "Oh, I love a good conversation, Elon. But I also love the truth. And the truth is, people say you're erratic, that you make reckless decisions. X, has become a chaotic mess under your leadership." Musk raised an eyebrow. "That's funny. It was losing billions before I took over, and now it's making a profit. Doesn't sound like chaos to me." Palmer smirked. "Right. But let's talk about something people really care about." He turned to the audience. "Do we have any Tesla owners in the crowd?" A few hands went up. Palmer grinned. "Nice. You guys trust the self-driving feature?" A few cheers. A few hesitations. "Interesting," Palmer said, turning back to Musk. "Because some people don't. There have been crashes, lawsuits, people losing their lives, and you keep pushing it like it's the future. Do you ever feel responsible when something goes wrong?" Musk's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. "You know, Bryant, we could talk about any car company and find accidents. But nobody asked Ford's CEO if he feels responsible when someone crashes a Mustang." Palmer chuckled. "Fair, fair. But Ford's not promising full self-driving. You are." Musk smiled. "Not yet. And neither are we. That's why we're still in beta." Palmer sighed theatrically. "All right, let's move on. Neuralink. Brain chips. What happens when hackers get in? Or when the government decides to, I don't know, turn people into robots?" A few audience members laughed nervously. Musk stayed quiet for a moment, then he said, "You watch too many movies, Bryant." The audience laughed again, but Palmer wasn't backing off. But Musk wasn't done either. Palmer tapped his cue cards on the desk, his smirk widening. He was enjoying himself now. "Come on, Elon, you can't tell me you don't see the risks. You want to put chips in people's brains, automate every car on the road, control internet satellites. At what point do we start calling it what it is? Power." Musk tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You think I'm trying to control people?" Palmer spread his hands. "I think when one man has influence over social media, transportation, space travel, artificial intelligence, and now the human brain, yeah, it raises some questions." The audience murmured. Some nodded. Others weren't so sure. Musk let the moment hang. Then he said, "I think people should ask questions. I think skepticism is healthy. But the idea that I'm sitting in some lair rubbing my hands together, that's a little ridiculous." Palmer chuckled. "Well, You did name one of your AI projects Ex Machina. Sounds pretty ominous. Musk smiled faintly. It's actually XI, but close. Palmer waved it off. Okay. But let's talk about something you can't dismiss so easily. He turned to the audience. Raise your hand if you've heard about the lawsuit against Tesla for racial discrimination. A few hands went up. Others stayed still. Musk's jaw didn't tighten. His expression didn't shift. But something changed in his eyes. Palmer pressed forward. There have been reports, Elon. Employees saying they were subjected to slurs, discrimination, unsafe work environments. That's happening inside your company. So I have to ask, how does the guy who wants to take humanity to Mars let this happen right here on Earth? A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Some people leaned forward. Others sat back, watching closely. Musk's voice was steady when he responded. You're talking about an issue that affects every major company in America. And when we found problems, we've taken action. Palmer scoffed. Right. So you're saying it's just business as usual? Musk exhaled softly. I'm saying it's not unique to Tesla, and it's not something we ignore. But if you want to talk about lawsuits, let's talk about your network. Palmer blinked. Just for a second. Excuse me? Musk leaned forward slightly. You work for a network that's been sued for pushing false information. You sit in that chair and call out corporate greed, but your show runs ads from pharmaceutical companies, billion-dollar banks, and defense contractors. The crowd stirred. This wasn't the usual back and forth anymore. Palmer chuckled, but it was thinner now. Nice deflection, but I'm not the one. Musk cut him off. You're not the one making billion-dollar deals behind closed doors. You're not the one taking orders from executives who decide what stories get airtime. You're not the one profiting off division. Silence. Palmer opened his mouth, but nothing came out right away. Musk continued, his voice calm. You want to talk about power? Let's talk about yours. You sit here pretending to be the voice of the people, but your paycheck comes from the same corporations you claim to call out. And the second you push too hard in the wrong direction, you're out of a job. The audience didn't know how to react. Some clapped, some just stared. Palmer forced a chuckle. So now you're flipping this on me? Musk shrugged. I thought you liked the truth. For the first time that night, Palmer didn't have a quick comeback. He shuffled his cue cards, trying to regain control. But something had shifted. Musk sat back, watching him, but the moment wasn't over yet. Palmer cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. The control he usually wielded so effortlessly was slipping, and the audience could feel it. But he wasn't about to let Musk take over his show. All right, he said, forcing a grin. You got your shot in. But let's be real, Elon. You love playing the underdog, the misunderstood genius, the rogue billionaire who's fighting against the system. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. But isn't that just branding? A man worth nearly $200 billion isn't against the system. You are the system. Musk tilted his head slightly. Am I? Of course, Palmer said. You're the richest man in the world. You buy companies when they annoy you. You joke about free speech, but let's be honest. You run X like your personal playground. You decide who gets to speak, who gets to stay, who gets silenced. Musk's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room had. The energy had shifted, heavier now, charged with something unspoken. Palmer wasn't done. And let's not forget, he added, flipping to another cue card, you're friends with some interesting people. Guys with a whole lot of influence. You and Peter Thiel. You and Saudi investors. You and... Musk cut him off. Would you like to talk about your friends, Bryant? The words weren't loud. They weren't even sharp. But they landed hard. Palmer blinked. Excuse me? Musk's voice was steady. The people who fund your show. The executives who decide what you're allowed to say. The political donors who make sure you never push too hard in one direction. The audience stirred. Palmer forced a chuckle. Oh, so now you're turning this into some kind of conspiracy? Come on, Elon. No conspiracy, Musk said. Just reality. You think I have power? You're right. But at least when I make a decision, people know where it's coming from. Can you say the same? Palmer opened his mouth, closed it. Musk kept going. I build things. People see them. They work or they don't. If I fail, the whole world sees it. But you? He gestured around the set. You sit here, pretending to challenge the powerful, while taking notes from them backstage. Palmer's face twitched. Just for a second. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Some of them were nodding. A few clapped. Palmer could feel the control slipping. He had to get it back. You're dodging the question, he said quickly. This isn't about me. It's about you. People say you're erratic, that you push dangerous ideas, that your employees are terrified of you. Do you even care about the consequences of what you do? Musk leaned forward, just slightly. Do you? Silence. Palmer opened his mouth again, but Musk wasn't finished. You make your living stirring outrage, he said calmly. You don't solve problems. You don't build anything. You just talk. And when the cameras stop rolling, when the controversy dies down, what have you actually done? Palmer shifted in his seat. Musk kept going. I get it, he said. Your job is to get people angry, to entertain, to keep the ad revenue flowing. But don't confuse that with actually making a difference. The audience felt that one. A few people clapped, others just watched, completely still. Palmer ran a hand through his hair, laughing tightly. Well, folks, he said, I think we just got a master class in deflection. Musk smiled. Or maybe in honesty. More claps. Palmer glanced at the producers off stage. They were watching carefully. His control over the interview was gone, and Musk knew it. But the real reaction was still coming. Palmer adjusted his tie, trying to keep the grin on his face, but something had shifted in the air. The confidence he had walked in with, the control he so effortlessly wielded over his guests, was slipping through his fingers. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to losing. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Some leaned forward, watching intently. Others exchanged glances, unsure of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another late-night interview. It was something else, something real. Palmer glanced at his cue cards again, but he barely registered the words. He needed to turn this around. Fast. So, Elon, he said, forcing his voice back into its usual rhythm. You came here to talk about innovation, about the future. Let's end on a positive note, shall we? He gestured broadly. What's next? What's the next big Musk project that's going to save humanity? It was a weak attempt at regaining control. Musk saw it. The audience saw it. But Musk leaned back slightly, considering the question. There are a lot of things in motion, he said finally. Advancing AI, space travel, sustainable energy. But I think the biggest challenge isn't technology. It's trust. Palmer raised an eyebrow. Trust? Musk nodded. People don't trust institutions anymore. They don't trust governments, the media, corporations. And most of the time, for good reason. A murmur ran through the crowd. Palmer gave a tight chuckle. And you think you are the solution? Musk shook his head. No, but I think honesty is. And I think people are tired of being manipulated. Palmer scoffed. So what? You're saying I'm the problem now? Musk tilted his head slightly. I think you're part of an industry that profits from keeping people divided, outraged, and distracted. You ask if I feel responsible for the things I create. Do you? Palmer blinked. For a split second, he had no answer. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then someone in the audience clapped. Then another. And another. Palmer's jaw tightened slightly, but he covered it with another forced smile. Well, he said, shifting in his chair, this has certainly been an interesting conversation. Musk nodded. I'd say so. The studio lights burned hot. The cameras kept rolling. Palmer licked his lips, then forced himself to move on. All right, folks, he said, turning back to the audience. Give it up for Elon Musk." A mix of applause and murmurs filled the room. Musk stood up, shook Palmer's hand, and walked off stage, leaving the host sitting there still trying to process what had just happened. But the real storm was only beginning. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the tension in the studio didn't fade. It thickened. The usual post-show chatter was muted, the usual flurry of producers, assistants, and camera operators moving with an odd quietness. Palmer ripped off his earpiece and tossed it onto the desk. His face was still plastered with a forced grin, but his eyes darted toward his producer. "What the hell was that?" he muttered under his breath. The producer didn't answer. He was too busy staring at his phone. So was half the studio. It had taken less than 5 minutes. The interview wasn't even officially online yet, but someone in the audience had been recording. Clips were already flooding social media. X, was on fire. The headline practically wrote itself. Elon Musk turns the tables on Bryant Palmer, calls out media hypocrisy on live TV. Musk had barely stepped backstage when his phone vibrated. He checked it. His mentions were skyrocketing. One clip, posted by an account with a few thousand followers, already had hundreds of thousands of views. The comments were pouring in. Elon just took Palmer apart like an engineer breaking down a bad prototype. This wasn't an interview. It was an execution. Palmer wasn't ready for this. At all. And then there were the think pieces, the debates, the analysis. Some called Musk's response brilliant. Others called it arrogant. Some claimed Palmer had walked right into his own trap, while others argued Musk had dodged real accountability by flipping the script. Either way, one thing was undeniable. People weren't talking about Palmer's questions. They were talking about Musk's answers. Palmer stormed into his dressing room, slamming the door shut. His producer followed, speaking carefully. "Listen, we need to be ready for how this is going to play out." Palmer scoffed, pouring himself a drink. "Oh, I know how it's going to play out. The internet's going to eat this up. Musk fanboys are going to act like he walked on water, and I'm going to be the biased journalist who got owned." He shook his head. The guy literally dodged every question. The producer hesitated. Did he, though? Palmer's jaw tightened. The producer sighed. "The thing is, Bryant, people don't like feeling like they've been manipulated. And tonight, you kinda looked like you were manipulating." Palmer's grip on his glass tightened. The producer glanced at his phone again. "We need to get ahead of this." Palmer exhaled sharply. "Yeah? And what do you suggest?" "Damage control." Palmer let out a bitter laugh. "You want me to apologize?" "Not happening." The producer shook his head. "Not an apology. A reframing. We spin it. Say Musk was deflecting. That he couldn't handle real scrutiny. That he proved he's just as thin-skinned as the people he criticizes." Palmer narrowed his eyes, considering it. But before he could answer, there was a knock at the door. An assistant stuck her head in. She looked nervous. "Bryant," she said carefully, "the network wants a meeting. Now." Musk walked out of the studio and straight into a waiting Tesla. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Big night?" Musk smirked. "Something like that." His phone buzzed again. A message from one of his closest advisors. "That was insane. Your engagement numbers just went through the roof." Musk scrolled through his feed, watching the narrative unfold in real time. Every reaction, every breakdown, every hot take. He could already see what was coming next. Tomorrow, Palmer's team would try to salvage this. They'd call him a billionaire playing victim, a master of deflection, a media manipulator. They'd spin it every way they could. But it wouldn't matter. Because tonight, in front of millions of people, the illusion had cracked. And once people see the cracks, they don't stop looking for more. By morning, the interview had become more than just a viral clip. It was a moment. News outlets scrambled to cover it, each offering their own interpretation. Some called Musk's response a masterclass in composure. Others painted Palmer as a journalist caught off guard by his own tactics. The debate wasn't just about what had been said. It was about what it meant. On one side, people saw Musk as a disruptor, someone who refused to play by the media's rules. A billionaire, yes, but one who spoke plainly, who wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy. On the other side, critics argued that Musk had dodged real accountability, that he had masterfully redirected the conversation without ever answering for the ethical concerns around his companies. But beyond the arguments, beyond the hot takes and think pieces, there was something deeper happening. People were questioning things. They were questioning how interviews were conducted, how narratives were shaped, how media figures like Palmer thrived on spectacle more than truth. And that's where the real shift happened. Because once an audience starts asking why something feels off, why a journalist seems more interested in a gotcha moment than a real discussion, why certain companies or industries never get held to the same scrutiny, once that process starts, it doesn't stop. And the media? It hates when people start thinking that way. At the network, the meeting was tense. Palmer sat across from the executives, arms crossed. He had been here before, after controversial interviews, but this time it felt different. One of the higher-ups, a woman in a navy suit, set down her phone. "The numbers are through the roof," she admitted. "Highest engagement we've had all year." Palmer forced a smile. "See? You're welcome." Another executive sighed. "The problem, Bryant, is that it's not going our way." Palmer scoffed. "Oh, come on, it's a news cycle. It'll die down in a few days." The woman in navy shook her head. "This is bigger than that. The comments, the reactions, people aren't just talking about Musk, they're talking about us, about the industry, about how we do interviews, about whether we're actually holding powerful people accountable or just playing a role." Palmer rolled his eyes. "They'll forget. They always do." A long pause. One of the executives exchanged a look with another. "Maybe," he said finally. "Or maybe this time, they won't." Across the country, Musk was sitting in a quiet office, sipping coffee, reading through the headlines. His team had already compiled the data: engagement spikes, media reactions, sentiment tracking. He barely paid attention to it. Instead, he scrolled through a simple post someone had made on X the night before. It wasn't from a journalist. It wasn't from a political pundit. It was just a regular person, someone who had watched the interview and summed it up in a single sentence. The scariest thing about last night wasn't what Musk said. It was realizing how badly the media wants to control the story. Musk smiled slightly, setting his phone down. He knew this moment wouldn't last forever. But it didn't have to. Because all it took was one crack in the facade. One moment where people saw the strings being pulled. And once you see the strings, you never look at the puppet show the same way again. The real lesson in all of this wasn't about Elon Musk or Bryant Palmer. It wasn't about who won or who lost the interview. It was about perception. People like Palmer had built careers on controlling narratives. They shaped public opinion, decided what was newsworthy, and framed discussions in ways that benefited their industry. But for the first time in a long time, the audience saw through it. And that's the part that truly mattered. Because in a world where information is everywhere, the real power doesn't belong to those who speak the loudest. It belongs to those who learn to listen. What do you think? Was this just another viral moment, or was it something bigger? Drop a comment below, hit the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more. Because the conversations that actually matter, they're just getting started.